I was logged into their system when the call came, and before the line even went dead, I already knew they'd made a fatal mistake. They said I violated policy, erased years of work with one sentence, and expected me to quietly disappear. Instead, I closed my laptop, smiled, and let the clock start ticking. If you've ever been punished for doing things the right way, stay with me. What they took from me was small. What it cost them was everything. Watch how fast power changes hands and hit subscribe, because this didn't end the way they thought it would. I didn't build value by being loud or likable. I built it by becoming unavoidable. Every Monday at 8:30 a.m., the Revenue Ops meeting started with my dashboard on the main screen, not because I asked for it, but because nothing moved without those numbers. Sales waited on my approval before closing deals. Finance refreshed my reports before speaking to the CFO. When a billing error surfaced, the ticket skipped 3 layers of management and landed directly in my queue, marked urgent. I wasn't managing people, I was managing outcomes. I redesigned their renewal flow after a single board review flagged leakage, cutting churn in half within 1 quarter. I automated manual approvals that had stalled invoices for weeks, and the backlog disappeared in days. The VP took credit in an all-hands meeting, thanked the team, and sent me a calendar invite afterward asking for a private walkthrough so he could answer questions if the board followed up. I sent the deck, accepted the invite, and watched him repeat my language verbatim to executives, while my name stayed off the slide. HR sent annual review forms that ranked visibility higher than results, then closed the window for edits before I could respond. When sales overpromised a client and the system flagged the mismatch, leadership didn't fix the promise. They asked me to override the alert. I declined in writing, copied compliance, and the deal stalled. 2 hours later, the override request was withdrawn, and I was quietly removed from the next planning meeting. Procurement approved expensive consultants to review processes I had already optimized, and I was instructed to onboard them anyway. I gave them access, watched them replicate my work, and tracked the errors they introduced when they misunderstood dependencies. Finance escalated the discrepancies. Operations blamed timing. Leadership scheduled an emergency sync and asked me to clean it up before the next cycle. I fixed the damage, logged the changes, and updated the audit trail. The thank you came as silence. The expectation came as another request sent late Friday, marked ASAP, assuming I'd absorb it. Every action pointed in one direction: extract the work, minimize the worker, and move on as if the system ran itself. It didn't. It ran because I was there, touching the right levers at the right moments, and they treated that like a background process instead of a person. The email arrived before noon, stamped urgent, sent from HR with the executive team quietly copied, and it opened with the kind of language companies use when they want something to feel final. My access would be terminated effective immediately due to a policy violation, my role eliminated, my responsibilities redistributed. No warning, no meeting request, no explanation beyond a single sentence that referenced an absence I had approval for in writing. I checked the calendar invite first, then the approval thread, then the travel authorization attached to it, all still there, all still intact. I replied with one line asking for clarification and attached the approval email. The response came back fast, shorter, colder, telling me the decision had already been reviewed and there was nothing to discuss. I picked up the phone and called HR directly. She answered on the second ring, voice steady, already prepared. She repeated the policy language, said the company needed to move quickly, said leadership had lost confidence, and advised me to return any company property within 48 hours. When I mentioned the written approval, she paused, then said approvals could be reconsidered if business needs changed. I asked who made that call. She said it wasn't appropriate to disclose. I asked if my system access would remain active until handoff. She said no handoff was required. The line went quiet for a moment, then she added that the company expected professionalism and cooperation during the transition. Before I could respond, she ended the call. I opened my inbox again and watched notifications disappear as permissions dropped in real time, folders graying out one by one. Slack signed me out mid-refresh. A calendar reminder popped up for a meeting I was no longer invited to, then vanished. 10 minutes later, a message from my manager landed in my personal email, not my work one, thanking me for my contributions and wishing me luck in my next chapter. No questions, no acknowledgement of the approval, no offer to speak. I forwarded that message to HR and asked whether it reflected the company's position. There was no reply. What did arrive was a system alert on my phone, the one notification they'd forgotten to disable, showing automated processes still running on schedules I had set. Billing cycles queued, renewals calculating, reports generating on their own. The company had moved fast to remove me, but it hadn't moved fast enough to understand what it had just cut loose. I didn't react right away, not because I was stunned, but because there was a process to follow. I opened the folder on my personal drive labeled Employment and pulled up the signed offer letter from 4 years earlier, then the attached contract addendum no one ever referenced after onboarding. I scrolled past compensation, benefits, non-compete language, and landed on the section that had mattered to me enough to flag the day I signed it. It spelled out ownership and usage rights in plain language, not legal gymnastics, and it drew a line between company-directed work and independently developed systems licensed back for operational use. I checked the timestamp on the file, then cross-referenced it with the system documentation I maintained separately, the version history showing when each major component had been built and why. The sequence was clean. I hadn't violated anything. They had. I opened my email and drafted a message addressed to HR and my manager, adding the CEO and legal distribution list from memory. I didn't accuse or threaten. I stated facts, cited the section number, attached the contract page, and explained that effective end of business day, the license allowing the company to use the revenue systems I had developed independently would be suspended pending review. I included a timestamp, requested acknowledgement, and asked that all further communication go through counsel. I sent it and archived the thread. Then I logged into the one dashboard still accessible through my personal authentication token, the one used for monitoring scheduled jobs and system health, and watched activity flow across the screen. Invoices queued for generation, renewal calculations staging for overnight runs, revenue reports compiling for leadership's weekly review. Nothing was broken, nothing was altered. The system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, which made the next step simple. I opened the access control panel and selected the licensing module, the one I'd insisted on building after a compliance audit years earlier had flagged dependency risk. I didn't touch production logic. I didn't delete data. I revoked authorization keys tied to the company's operational account, leaving the framework intact but inactive without validation. The change propagated in seconds. Jobs continued to queue but no longer executed. The dashboard shifted from green to amber, then settled into a steady warning state. I documented the action, exported the logs, and saved them locally. My phone vibrated almost immediately. First an email marked high importance, then a missed call, then another. I didn't answer. I watched as alerts triggered downstream, systems attempting retries, automated fail-safes engaging exactly as designed. 10 minutes later, another email arrived, this one from my manager, demanding restoration and accusing me of interfering with company property. I replied once, attaching the same contract page, repeating that the system was not company property and that use without a valid license constituted unauthorized access. I asked him to confirm in writing that he had reviewed the document. He didn't. Instead, a calendar invite appeared for an emergency meeting I wasn't invited to, followed by a company-wide notification about a temporary reporting delay. I closed my laptop and set it aside. I had done what the contract allowed, what the documentation supported, and what the system required. Everything that followed was no longer about technology. It was about how fast an organization could unravel when the person it dismissed was the one holding the map. The first sign wasn't panic, it was confusion. A sales manager emailed asking why invoices scheduled for release were still sitting in draft. 10 minutes later, finance replied, all saying the billing queue showed pending status with no errors, which didn't make sense. Then operations chimed in saying renewals weren't updating and customer accounts were locked in review. I wasn't included in the thread, but I could see the alerts ripple through the system. Retries stacking, timeouts increasing, dashboards stalling just enough to raise questions without triggering alarms. By mid-afternoon, the tone shifted. Another message went out labeling it a minor reporting delay, advising teams to proceed as normal. They couldn't. Sales couldn't close because billing hadn't confirmed. Finance couldn't reconcile because revenue hadn't posted. Customer success started fielding calls from clients who'd been promised confirmations that never arrived. I received my first direct call from an executive assistant asking if I could jump on for 5 minutes to explain what might be happening. I didn't respond. An hour later, the assistant emailed again, copying my former manager and HR, asking whether I was aware of any recent changes that could affect revenue processing. I forwarded my earlier notice about license suspension and asked them to confirm receipt. No one did. Instead, a message went out from leadership instructing teams to manually process urgent accounts. That worked for 3 invoices before discrepancies appeared. Manual overrides conflicted with automated controls I'd built to prevent duplicate billing, and the system flagged the attempts as violations. Compliance stepped in, froze the manual process, and asked for an explanation. The explanation never came. At 4:30 p.m., an emergency meeting was scheduled for the executive team. I wasn't invited, but I knew exactly what they were seeing because the same reports they relied on were now blank. Forecasts showed 0 growth for the day. Monthly projections recalculated downward in real time. A revenue shortfall alert triggered for a key client, the one leadership had been counting on to close the quarter strong. My phone lit up again, this time with a call from a number I recognized as the CFO's. I let it ring. 5 minutes later, an email arrived marked confidential, asking me to immediately restore access and warning that my actions were being interpreted as hostile. I replied with one sentence. Access was suspended per contract terms, and any further use without authorization would be documented. I attached the logs. That's when the language changed. The next message wasn't angry, it was careful. HR asked whether there had been a misunderstanding and suggested we talk through options. Operations asked if there was a temporary workaround. Legal asked for clarification on the scope of the system affected. None of them acknowledged the firing. None of them apologized. By early evening, customer support had opened a priority channel to handle complaints from accounts whose invoices hadn't generated. One client escalated directly to the VP, threatening to delay payment until confirmation arrived. Another flagged their contract's service level clause and asked whether the company was still in compliance. Those emails moved fast. The internal ones slowed. Someone tried to spin up a parallel process using exported data from the previous week. It failed when totals didn't match current activity. Another team attempted to reroute billing through a legacy tool that hadn't been maintained in years. It crashed under load. The alerts on my dashboard shifted from amber to red as safeguards locked down additional functions to prevent corruption. Around 8 p.m., a company-wide message went out acknowledging a system outage, affecting revenue operations and promising updates by morning. I watched as executives who had signed off on my termination scrambled to explain a problem they didn't understand to a board that expected certainty. The system wasn't broken. It was waiting. Waiting for authorization they no longer had and for a decision they couldn't avoid. Every hour that passed widened the gap between what leadership promised and what the company could deliver, and there was nothing they could do about it without coming back to the person they'd decided was disposable. By the next morning, they stopped pretending it was a glitch and started treating it like a threat. Legal reached out first, not with a greeting, but with an attachment. A formal notice accusing me of interfering with operations and demanding immediate restoration of access. The language was sharp, full of words meant to intimidate, but light on specifics. I replied once, acknowledging receipt and restating that the system was operating exactly as designed, that access had been suspended under the licensing terms, and that any attempt to bypass authorization would be logged. Within minutes, my phone rang again, this time from a number I didn't recognize. A consultant introduced himself as an external specialist hired to assess system recovery options. He asked technical questions framed as hypotheticals, probing for gaps. I answered none of them. Instead, I told him plainly that continuing without authorization could expose everyone involved to unnecessary risk and that he should relay that to whoever engaged him. He paused, thanked me, and hung up. The calls kept coming. Operations wanted a temporary bridge. Finance asked if a partial unlock was possible. HR suggested mediation. None of them mentioned reversing the termination. None of them addressed the approval they'd ignored. They wanted the outcome without the cost. Midday, an internal message leaked into my inbox from a colleague who hadn't realized I'd been removed from distribution lists. It described a board check-in scheduled for that afternoon, with leadership scrambling to explain why revenue reporting had gone dark overnight. I watched the dashboard as more safeguards tripped, not because of sabotage, but because too many hands were pulling in the wrong direction. Someone attempted to reissue invoices manually again, triggering duplicate warnings. Compliance froze the batch. Customer success escalated 3 accounts at once, all tied to renewals that now showed pending indefinitely. One client paused their payment and cited breach review. Another asked for written assurance the company could still support them. Those messages didn't get answered quickly. The executives were busy. Around 3 p.m., a message finally arrived from the CEO. It was careful, measured, and framed as a request for help rather than an order. He acknowledged there appeared to be a dependency issue and asked whether I'd be willing to consult to resolve it. I replied that consultation would require a written agreement and that any discussion needed to address the termination and licensing terms first. There was no response. Instead, the pressure shifted sideways. A junior analyst I'd worked with years earlier emailed me privately, apologizing for reaching out, explaining that she'd been asked to recreate reports manually for leadership and didn't understand why totals wouldn't reconcile. I told her the truth in one sentence. The system required authorization to finalize calculations, and she shouldn't put her name on anything that bypassed controls. She thanked me and stopped replying. An hour later, another legal email landed, this one warning of potential damages and referencing urgent business harm. I forwarded it to my attorney and continued watching the activity logs. Attempts to access restricted functions spiked, then flattened as someone higher up must have ordered them to stop. The company-wide update that evening admitted the outage would extend into the next day. Comments were disabled. Internally, calendars filled with emergency meetings. Externally, clients waited. Every move they made confirmed the same truth. They could pressure, threaten, and posture, but they couldn't proceed. They had dismissed the person who understood the system's boundaries and were now colliding with them in real time. The system held because it was built to, and because I hadn't given them permission to cross the line they were pretending didn't exist. The invitation arrived without ceremony, a forwarded calendar link sent by the CEO's assistant asking if I was available for an urgent discussion. No subject line, no explanation, just a video call scheduled 30 minutes out. I joined on time and found the screen already crowded. The CEO sat centered, legal to one side, HR on mute, and my former boss off to the right, shoulders hunched, eyes darting between boxes as if he were waiting for permission to speak. No one introduced me. No one apologized. The CEO opened by saying the situation had escalated beyond expectations and that the board was now involved. He asked my former boss to explain how the company had become dependent on a system it didn't fully control. My name came up immediately, not as credit, but as a problem. He said I had built processes no one else understood, that documentation was incomplete, that risk hadn't been properly managed. The CEO asked why those concerns hadn't been addressed before my termination. There was a pause long enough to be uncomfortable. My former boss cleared his throat and started talking about timelines, competing priorities, how fast the company had grown. Halfway through his explanation, legal interrupted and asked him directly whether he had reviewed the licensing terms tied to the system before approving my termination. He said he assumed HR had. HR unmuted and said approvals were based on management input. The CEO leaned back, silent, watching the exchange unravel. Then the board chair joined the call without warning. She didn't raise her voice. She asked one question. Who made the decision to terminate the person responsible for revenue processing during an active cycle without confirming system ownership? My former boss tried to answer and failed. He blamed miscommunication, said he was under pressure to act quickly, said he believed the company held the rights. The board chair asked if he could point to the document that supported that belief. He couldn't. His voice cracked when he admitted he hadn't read the clause. The room went still. I was finally addressed directly. The CEO asked what it would take to restore operations. I stated my terms calmly, the same ones I'd already sent, and added that I would not continue this conversation until the termination was formally acknowledged as an error. My former boss looked at me then, really looked, and asked if we could talk privately. The board chair cut him off and said this was not a private matter anymore. She asked HR to confirm whether my absence had been approved. HR confirmed it had. She asked why the termination email cited policy violations. HR said it was based on information provided. The board chair thanked her and said the board would handle accountability. The CEO turned to my former boss and told him to step off the call. He hesitated, then disconnected. No one followed him. The CEO apologized for the first time formally on the record and asked me to stay while legal outlined next steps. The power in the room had shifted completely. The person who once signed off on my dismissal without a conversation had been removed in front of everyone, and there was nothing left for him to say. The paperwork moved faster than the chaos ever had. Within hours of that call, legal sent a revised agreement, acknowledging the termination had been issued in error and confirming the company's acceptance of my licensing terms. The language was careful, stripped of emotion, but the meaning was clear. They needed the system back, and they understood now what it cost to treat expertise like a line item. I waited for confirmation of payment before doing anything else. When the transfer hit my account the next morning, I logged in, restored authorization, and watched the backlog clear in waves. Invoices generated, renewals finalized, reports repopulated. The system stabilized exactly as it always had when left alone. I sent a single confirmation email stating operations were restored and that all future requests should go through the consulting channel outlined in the agreement. There were no replies. The company announced a leadership change later that afternoon, citing a strategic realignment. Names weren't mentioned, but the timing said enough. I didn't celebrate. I closed my laptop and went about my day because the outcome wasn't about winning an argument, it was about ending a pattern. A week later, a message arrived from a recruiter I didn't know, referencing recent events and asking if I'd consider a conversation. That turned into a call, then another, then an offer that came with a title that matched the work I'd been doing all along. The compensation was higher, the authority was explicit, and the contract language was precise about ownership and boundaries. I accepted without negotiating down my worth. My former company became a client in the most literal sense. They submitted requests through a portal, paid invoices on time, and addressed me formally in every communication. The relationship worked because it was honest. There were no assumptions, no blurred lines, no expectation of free labor disguised as loyalty. Months later, HR sent a brief note informing me that new approval protocols had been implemented to prevent similar situations. I acknowledged it and moved on. I didn't take calls asking to reconnect. I didn't meet for coffee to clear the air. Some lessons only hold if they aren't softened. The difference now is simple. My work is visible, my authority is documented, and my time is treated as finite. When I log off, nothing collapses because expectations are aligned and systems are shared, not hoarded. That's what respect looks like in practice. Not praise, not promises, not company slogans, but clear terms and real consequences. The people who tried to erase me learned that removing a name doesn't remove responsibility. It just exposes where it was concentrated all along. I didn't burn anything down. I followed the rules they signed, and when the structure they relied on stopped moving, they finally had to face how much of it had been resting on one person they thought they could discard. What stayed with me wasn't the call or the boardroom silence. It was the quiet moments around them. The unanswered email where I attached proof and got nothing back. The meeting invite that excluded me while my work filled the screen. The moment my former boss couldn't answer a single question because he'd never read what he signed. That's when I understood the real advantage I'd been carrying. Not confidence, not aggression, preparation. I kept records because I didn't trust praise. I documented approvals because promises faded. I built safeguards because I'd watched leaders move fast and check later. When they fired me, they thought the power lived in titles and access. It didn't. It lived in timestamps, attachments, logs, and the patience to wait while other people panicked. I didn't raise my voice in that meeting. I didn't argue. I let the facts speak until the room turned on itself. That's the hidden strength people underestimate. It's not dramatic in the moment, but it's devastating when tested. If I had relied on memory instead of emails, or trust instead of documentation, that humiliation would have been mine. Instead, it belonged to the people who assumed no one would ever check. If you're still working somewhere that feels unstable, here's what I'd tell you as a friend. Keep your approvals. Save the quiet messages. Don't explain yourself more than necessary. When something feels off, write it down. Power doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like waiting, watching, and knowing exactly when to speak. How to get started today. Save approval emails outside company systems. Keep a simple timeline of key decisions. Document meetings with follow-up summaries. Separate your work from your identity. Read what you sign every time. If this sounds familiar, share how you protect yourself at work or how you wish you had.